Thanks, guys. Everyone, sorry for a little bit of delay. We had a struggle with the Wi-Fi, which is not a good way to start because everybody knows I'm a little nervous about speaking in front of people.
You're gonna do awesome.
Act like we're not
Yes.
here.
Don't be afraid.
Tonight, I'm going to talk for a little bit about the history of money and finance and how it affects this crazy world we're living in. And when I get done, Todd is going to talk a little bit about his career in law enforcement and do some Q&A. This is the first time I've given this presentation. I've been studying this stuff for a long time, but I've got 7 pages of notes here, so I'll be reading a little bit, and hopefully it won't be too scripted. But here we go. I don't know if the Zoom can see the board here, but the main theme is he who controls the supply of money or currency rules. And it's a theme that's showed up quite a few times in history, and I'm going to kind of walk you back through that. But I'm going to start with where we are today, and I'm going to read a quote from a guy by the name of William Blackstone in the 1700s that really applies to what's going on in the world. And he wrote that the king can do no wrong is a necessary and fundamental principle of the English Constitution. What he meant by that was the king can't be held accountable for his crimes. He can do whatever he wants and he's never guilty. It's called criminal immunity and plenary power. And of course, we don't have kings in America, or do we? And I'm going to make the case that we do. And I'm going to talk to you a little about how it happened and when it happened. We're all old enough to remember the great financial crisis of 2008 and 9. Goldman Sachs, and I'm going to read a great quote. Matt Taibbi is a leftist writer for the Rolling Stone. He wrote what I consider the greatest opening paragraph, probably in journalistic history. The first thing you need to know about Goldman Sachs is that it's everywhere. The world's most powerful investment bank is a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. That's one of the kings of the banks. So in 2009, we had all the information we needed to, these bankers, they committed crimes, people lost their fortunes. The world monetary supply in 5 quarters dropped 40%. Yet nobody went to jail. And you want to talk about criminal immunity and plenary power? That's a pretty good example of that. Some quotes from that period of time. Goldman's legal argument, which apparently our Department of Justice followed verbatim. Based on the law and evidence as they exist at this time, there is not a viable basis to bring a criminal prosecution. Goldman was guilty of criminal fraud and got away with it. The DOJ doesn't investigate crimes of global banks for fear of what's called collateral consequences. Who determines those consequences? The DOJ regulators, the DOJ says the regulators determine the consequences, but this is a lie. Consequences is an ever recurring threat from global banks to crash the system if they are ever held to account. It means if we go to jail, your economy's gone. They've done it over and over again throughout history. Better example of that was HSBC. That's a British bank, and they were caught red-handed and even admitted they were guilty of money laundering. The list goes on and on. It would have been the easiest case in history. And the DOJ actually planned to prosecute HSBC. And something interesting happened. The Bank of International Settlements, located in Switzerland, is the central bank. And they created something in 2009 called the FSB, the Financial Stability Board. And basically what the DOJ said is that HSBC is going to get immunity because BIS law or FSB rules superseded American law. So they got this, our DOJ got pressured by all of our bankers and a couple of British bankers. Why are British bankers involved in our court system? Well, they were. HSBC walked, not a single banker went to jail. So we're talking about criminal immunity and plenary power. And the banks have that. A coup occurred in America in 2012 when nobody was held accountable. Our rule of law, the basic premise of it is nobody is above the law and nobody's below it. Well, now we got people that are above the law, and that is a problem. So let's talk a little bit about the history. Am I doing okay so far?
Yes.
I'll go through this part pretty quickly, but the history of money, I'm talking about who controls the supply of money. You go back a couple thousand years and it was always the temples. We know the story of Jesus Christ throwing the money lenders out. That was called the Pontifical Royal period of coinage. There was also the Republican period where the senates of Rome, Greece, Byzantium, and some of those other ancient civilizations that flourished because the Senate controlled the supply of money. In Rome is a great example. Their currency was copper and brass, and it was plentiful and cheap money. Now, a lot of us have been talking about, we print too much money, too plentiful, and that's a problem that causes inflation. And we had a lot of people that say gold standard is a solution. Maybe, maybe not. It's more important as who controls the supply than what you use as the medium of currency. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, names himself emperor for life, and after several hundred years of Rome flourishing and the citizens being wealthy, Caesar took us off that standard, minted a bunch of gold coins with his face on it, made himself emperor for life, and basically ushered in 1300 years of the Dark Ages. It all started right there. It had more to do with the supply of that gold. About 90% of the purchasing power of the average Roman citizen disappeared in about 50 years. So that was a bit of a problem. The Republican period was great. Everyone flourished, except for the people the Romans were killing, but that's and that was the third period that the Caesar started. Julius Caesar was called the Pontifical Imperial period. Then the next period ended, and something really interesting happened in around 1200. And this, most of the rest of this talk is going to be about England and American banking, and that's really what's moved the world for the last almost 1,000 years. Henry I was low on gold due to all the wars they've been fighting. You're going to hear me say this a few times, and you've probably heard it before. All wars are banker wars. Right? There's no truer statement will ever be said. In this particular case, you have the goldsmiths running around, and you occasionally would have over that 1300-year period, bankers, the goldsmiths would say, okay, I'll give you some paper money that you can reclaim for gold. And they figured out the trick that if I've got 1,000 pounds of gold, I can lend out more than 1,000 pounds of paper as long as nobody else claims it at the same time. I'm good to go. Well, a couple of times people figured that out. Everyone would run in and try to get their gold at once, and then you get a bank. It's called a bank panic, and that's happened throughout history. But what Henry I did is he came up with a concept called tally sticks, and he said these are going to be good, money good, and the king controlled the supply of money. He said you can use these pieces of wood that they split down the middle and put notches on them and use that to pay debt. Sounds pretty silly, right? Everyone wants a gold standard. No, it worked for 600 years. Pretty much ended that whole system, created a middle class, led to the writing of the Magna Carta, created a mercantile class that needed trade routes, the growth of towns, merchants needed stability, and they loved the rule of law. It was a great period of time that led us into the Renaissance. People were able to start affording things like, literature, so people like William Shakespeare could be financed. 1265, about 100 years after that started, the first parliamentary elections held and government by the people began. And a lot of that credit needs to go to these pieces of wood called tally sticks. Feudalism dwindled and serfdom was banned in the 1600s. Life was pretty good until the Fifth Age, which, hang on, what do we call this one? Oh, the age of private coinage period. In 1600, the British East India Company is founded. They were basically selling goods back and forth to India and other places around the world. Well, they figured out an arbitrage trade where they could take 6 ounces of silver from London, sail it on over to India, and bring it back as 12 ounces of silver. But they weren't allowed to do that because the monarchs had the power to, they had to get permission. So in 1662, Charles II gave them, they got permission to export silver to India. In 1662, Charles II made it permanent. In 1666, these merchants, which would eventually grow into something called the Council of 300, which if you put your tinfoil hat on and go down the rabbit holes on the internet, are one of the true masters of the universe. That came from the British East India Company. What they did by getting the ability to mint coin for private hands is they took the sovereign right of coin mintage away from the crown. And now the person who mints coin are a bunch of private merchants. What could possibly go wrong? They bribed officials and kings. At the time, the basic pillars of in British society was the crown, church, lords, and commons. And all of a sudden, these people added a fifth one called financiers. And they made a lot of money, and a lot of things went wrong. They destroyed the royal prerogative of coinage. Here's a great quote from Aristotle. It ties into this theory. Money exists not by nature, but by law. Money is a legal instrument. It is not something that just exists. It should be controlled by the people that have the control of the laws. About 100 years later, we have a new player. You might have heard of the Rothschilds. Well, they perfected the game. Nathan Amschel Rothschilds, and I'm going to read a quote off my phone. I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the empire. The man that controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the money supply. The audacity of saying that publicly in the face of a monarch is pretty impressive. They also are the ones that discovered that it was really good. They created central banking, and basically their whole business model is lending money to the governments and getting it back at interest. That's the entire business model. And eventually they did it enough time, and it's beneficial for someone who's a centralized bank like that. It didn't take long for Rothschild to basically control the Bank of England. They created and control it. And if you want to make more money, you want to get more people. You want them to borrow more and more money. And the best way to get a government to borrow money is to have wars. And Rothschilds are really good at financing both sides of the war. They don't care who wins or loses. They get paid by both eventually. And if you don't do what they say, they threaten to crash your markets. The British system turned into, well, here's what gets interesting. Toward the late 1700s, about 75% of England's entire budget was used to repay war bonds. So what did they do? They basically started squeezing their colonies. And we're going to get to that in a second here. But I want to talk about the mercantilist system with British adapted. That was their system of, I guess, economy. It was a mercantilist system. What that basically meant, they have this theory that there's a finite amount of gold and silver in the world. And your nation's obligation was to collect as much of that for yourself as you could. It's very similar to, and it basically, is the people closest to the crown or closest to the seats of power with all this debt would benefit from it at the expense of everybody else. The only difference between that and what we're living through today is we don't believe there's a finite amount of gold and silver. We believe there's an infinite amount of digital currency we can print. But the mercantilist system it's really important to understand it because it comes into play when America gets founded. So what caused the actual revolution? There's all kinds of things, but part of that mercantilist system is they were demanding that all the gold and silver that's produced in America gets sent back to England. So the colonists really didn't have any money to play with. So they created what was called colonial script. Well, the Brits didn't like that very much. They started squeezing us. Remember, they've got all this war debt and stuff like that. They don't like the fact that we're not playing their game. We're creating a parallel economy. What a great idea. Maybe someone else should think of that. And it worked out pretty well. I mean, the colonists, the Brits got mad. They created the Currency Act, which required the colonies to conduct all business in printed banknotes borrowed and banknotes borrowed from the bank, the Rothschilds, at interest. That was a requirement the British required us to do. That really ticked off the colonials. So that's when they came up with their colonial script. Ben Franklin writes, the refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the revolution. It gave us a plutocracy, which is ruled by the rich. Well, what really set off the revolution, people don't march in the streets until they can't feed their families. And that's what happened to the colonists, to the colonials. We had our colonial script, and the Brits realized they could just counterfeit it and flood our markets. Remember, he who controls the supply of money rules? Well, they did that to us. We had hyperinflation, people couldn't feed their family, the war started. Fortunately, the good guys won, and I'm not going to get into all that. But one of the interesting things that came out of it was, we've got the Constitution. And in Article 1, Section 8, the founding fathers were smart. They understood this stuff. They wrote, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Basically, they were saying, we, the people, through our representatives, are going to control the supply of money. 2 years later, there's a big push to create the first national bank and first bank of the United States. Just the opposite of what that says. Congress, within 2 years of the Constitution being ratified, was already passing off their duty to the New York financial interests, which tells you how long corporations have been bribing our politicians. This is basically comes down to Hamilton versus Jefferson. When I talked to Doug, this is one thing. The fact that we knew we were going to be friends because we agreed on our dislike for Alexander Hamilton, and it's for this purpose whatsoever. Hamilton wanted Washington to be a king. He wanted us to be a mercantilist system. Jefferson did not. He opposed all that. In fact, he actually wanted a smaller government than we got. But Washington, Wade had Hamilton and Jefferson both present their cases, and Hamilton won. There's a couple of theories out there, and I'm not sure if I agree with this or not, that think there's no small coincidence that at the exact same period of time, they were trying to figure out exactly where Washington, D.C., a 10 by 10 piece of real estate was going to be, and it ended up adjacent to Washington's Mount Vernon property. Don't know if that's conspiracy theory or not, but it's an interesting observation. So we got the first national bank in 1791. First thing that immediately the national debt implodes, which means Hamilton and all his mercantilist buddies get to be close to the seats of power. They get to take advantage of all that. Hamilton did something. To tell you what kind of guy Hamilton was, he got named Secretary of the Treasury pretty early on, and he had no financial economic background. And he got named that because if I blank on this name, I'm gonna be so mad at myself. One of the founding fathers, signer of the Declaration, signer of the Constitution from Pennsylvania, and I'm drawing a blank on his name. I'll get it. I'll come back to it. Very wealthy man, helped finance the Revolution. He was in Hamilton's corner, and he whispered in Washington's ear, this guy should be your Treasury Secretary. Sure, why not? Guy didn't know anything about finance. It sounds like what we do today. Immediately, the American debt implodes. All this interest goes on. Hamilton does this thing with the veterans of the Revolutionary War had been paid in this colonial scrip or state-issued scrip, and it was pretty much trading for about 5 cents on the dollar. They weren't getting paid. In fact, their revolt against not being paid was what caused the founding fathers to realize the Articles of Confederation, they were too weak because the veterans were basically sitting on the state capitol steps and demanding their money, and the federal government didn't have enough power to do anything about that. Well, Hamilton comes up with this idea that we're going to basically nationalize that debt, which means there's bonds, there's outstanding bonds that are trading at 5 cents on the dollar are going to be made whole. But he doesn't tell everyone else. He tells his buddies, and they send out the fastest riders and the fastest ships. They go all around the colonies. They buy out all these veterans' money for 5 cents on the dollar. They take it back, and 3 months later, it's 100 cents on the dollar. Millions of dollars were made. And the guy's name was Robert Morris. Finally figured it out. So anyways, the first bank of the United States was an absolute disaster. Congress was absolutely got the message they were not going to renew the charter, but it was a bit of a debate. In 1811, Nathan Meyer Rothschild writes very publicly, either the application for renewal of the charter, sorry, it was a 20-year charter to start with, and it was up for re-election in 1811. So either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the U.S. will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. The War of 1812 started 6 months later. Rothschilds threatened it, and it happened. More interesting, the Europeans, well, we'll get into, I'm going to skip that part, but no territory was gained or lost during the War of 1812. It was pretty darn useless. But what it did is the American government had to spend a lot of money and go into debt. And in 1816, Congress realized the only way they can be able to pay this debt was to found the charter of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. Massive debt expansion, absolute disaster. The hero of the war of 1812, Andrew Jackson, then runs for president on a platform of ending the bank. And the bank's gotten pretty powerful. The guy who ran the central bank's guy by the name Nicholas Biddle. And when that charter, Jackson ran on ending the bank, but it wasn't until 1835 that it actually happened because the charter was coming up in 1 year. Congress had to agree to renew it or not. And Biddle's statement of, basically how he was going to get Congress to do it, because nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effects on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm monetary restriction causing recession. and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to restoration of the currency and recharter of the bank. He threatened to crash the economy to force Congress to renew the charter. Jackson's quote, and it's a really long one, but it's worth it. Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I have had men watching you for a long time and am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. Sound familiar? You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you'll ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. Jackson won.
Wow.
They tried to assassinate him. About 2 weeks later, both guns misfired. This is going to be a recurring theme. Those who speak out against the banks, they get assassinated. So we get about 25 years of peace. The Civil War is, we're now up to the Civil War period. I'm not going to get into the cause, really directly into the cause of the Civil War, whether it was about slavery or anything like that. But I will tell you that the British monetary interests really wanted to divide the colonies into multiple pieces. And as proof of that, when the Civil War broke out, the English had a huge army up in Canada, and the British and the French had a huge army down in Mexico, waiting to scrape up the pieces. Well, Lincoln, mixed bag. I'm not going to get into my dislike of some of the things Lincoln did, but one thing he was dedicated to was preserving the Union at any cost. It's the at any cost part that I've got an issue with Lincoln with, but he did accomplish what he wanted to do. And how did he do that? We had to borrow money to fight this war, and the European bankers wanted to charge him interest rates as high as 30%. So what he did is he created the concept of greenbacks. Greenbacks are basically backed by nothing. It was a sovereign government issuing its own currency. He who controls the supply of currency rules. It was incredibly effective, the greenback system. Quote from the London Times in 1864. Show you how much these banker-owned entities felt about, real currencies. If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. So everyone knew that these greenbacks were very dangerous. They win the war, and of course, Lincoln is assassinated. What happens next leads us into the Gilded Age. Yes.
So the greenbacks, it was just printed paper,
It was paper.
it was not backed by gold or anything?
It was backed by nothing.
Okay.
It was a fiat currency that we're taught to hate, but it doesn't matter what the currency is backed by. It matters who issues the supply. This is the lesson here. And they call it greenbacks because to make it hard to counterfeit. It was a forefather of our current really hard to counterfeit currencies. So immediately after Nixon's assassination, Congress signs the 1866 Contraction Act to retire the greenbacks in circulation. They decrease the money supply, which basically crashes the economy. We enter the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1900. And basically, to characterize the Gilded Age, you think things are bad today with corruption, monetary inequality and stuff like that. There's nothing compared to what the Gilded Age was. We had massive immigration coming from Europe. We had huge industrialization. Incredible fortunes were built. And yet the average money per capita went from 1866, it was $50.46. By 1886, it was $6.67, an 84% contraction. That's what they did by decreasing the supply of money. The people who got rich, you had the Morgans in the banking industry. You had the Rockefellers in the oil industry. We had the Carnegies in the steel industry. We had the Vanderbilts in the railroad industry. And these are the most cutthroat, brutal monopolists that ever lived. They destroyed competition. Definition of a cartel. It's a very important concept because we're living under that right now. Cartel functions for two purposes: to maximize profits and to eliminate competition. And what they do is they lobby Congress, they buy the congressman, They create barriers to entry. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So if competition can't emerge, and if competition does emerge, they find a way to crush them with regulation. This is what they did in the robber barons. The politics of the Gilded Age were worse than, maybe arguable. I've got to still kind of waffling on whether it's worse than we have today. They worked with ward bosses in all the cities. So you had all these immigrants who come to America with this promise of the great American dream, and basically was working slave labor for $1 a day for most of them. So you come to a city, and the only way you get a job was to be signed up with a ward boss, because they, were the ones who handed out the jobs. Well, these ward bosses then said the only way you get a job is if you promise to vote the way I tell you. Okay. They sold the votes to the politicians, and it was both the Republicans and the Democrats. There is no right or left. All right, there's only us against them. That's how the world worked back then. There were riots. It was that part was worse. All right, how are we doing on time? Okay, I'm on pace. So the Coinage Act of 1873 destroyed silver and put us back on the gold standard. Who owned all the gold? Who owned all the gold? The European bankers, because the Rothschilds have been buying up gold mines for the last 100 years. So they wanted us back on a gold standard where they controlled the supply. So our Congress puts us on the Coinage Act of 1873, which will later be called the crime of 1873. It made money more scarce. Everyone hated it. It did not comport with expanding economy. We had riots in 1877. Pittsburgh and Chicago got set on fire. The American Bank Association, so everybody demanded a return to greenbacks. They were popular. People liked them. Things worked. But the American Bank Association didn't. It is advisable to do all in your power to sustain such prominent daily and weekly newspapers. He's writing it to the other bankers, especially the agriculture and religious press, as will oppose the greenback issue of money. To repeal the act creating banknotes or to restore the circulation of the government issue of money will be to provide the people with money and will therefore seriously affect our individual profits as bankers and lenders. See your congressman at once and engage him to support our interests that we may control legislation. This is what the American Bank Association is telling all the bankers. Garfield becomes president, very popular man. And he had a great quote that we'll talk about some recurring themes here. He had been investigating what's called the Black Friday gold market scandal of 1869, where the bankers manipulated the market, blah, 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 trading places style. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. Sounds familiar. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few very powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. They do this on purpose. They inflate the economy, everyone makes money, they take their profits, they decrease the money supply, everyone else loses, they come in and buy all the goods on the cheap. Rinse, wash, repeat. Garfield gave that speech and was assassinated. Several weeks later, depression deepened. In September 1894, this is from the American Bank Association again. We will not renew our loans under any consideration. He said on September 1st, 1894, we will stop renewing loans. On that date, we will demand our money back. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and hundreds of them east of the Mississippi as well at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants, as in England. This is the American Banking Association. This is their plan. One more thing the ABA did in 1892. Sorry, 1880. Silver certificates and treasury bonds, that is to say, all of the government's money must be retired. And interest-bearing national banknotes made the only money. They've been at this a long time. You will at once retire 1/3 of your circulation, paper money, and call in half of your loans. They want to decrease the money supply. Be careful to make a monetary emergency among your patrons, especially among the influential businessmen. So make sure you help out the connected ones. The future of our debt-based money system depends upon immediate action, as there is an increasing sentiment in favor of government legal tender notes and silver coinage. The populists were winning. They created a, what's the name of it? They called it the Greenback Party. And 1878, the Greenback political party actually won 21 congressional seats. More panics. I want to read one more. William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat, populist, and one of the most brilliant orators of that period of time, in 1896 at the DNC convention, writes, "What we need is an Andrew Jackson to stand as Jackson stood against the encroachments of aggregated wealth. We say in our platform that we believe that the right to coin money and issue money is a function of government. We believe it. We believe it is a part of sovereignty. Those who are opposed to this proposition tell us that the issue of paper money is a function of the bank and that the government ought to go out of the banking business. I stand with Jefferson rather than with them and tell them as he did that the issue of money is a function of government and that banks should go out of the governing business." He was almost our president a couple of times. He ran 3 times and didn't do too poorly. So that ends the Gilded Age in about 1900. Teddy Roosevelt gets elected, theoretically busted the trusts. Didn't happen. Rockefellers, Carnegies, Vanderbilts, they were more powerful than ever. 1913, a lot of things happened. Creature from Jekyll Island, book that must be read by everybody or watch a video. Several things happened. They gave us the Federal Reserve System. They gave us the income tax. They gave us the 17th Amendment. Also what happened is the first tax-free foundations were put into existence. And these were the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And why would you create a tax-free foundation and give the rest of the world an income tax? Well, because you're greedy bastards. And they basically put their generational wealth behind these foundations. And the other things they did, which kind of corresponds to what's going on today, is they created the FDA and the American Cancer Institute and flooded with charity because they had all these tax write-offs. Now, they became charitably inclined and they basically started sponsoring all the American medical schools. And they wanted to push allopathic medicine as opposed to homeopathic medicine. And so they could sell their petroleum-based pharmaceuticals. And we've been dealing with that ever since. But back to banking. So that's 1913 with the Federal Reserve. How did that come about? It's really interesting. A lot of these big banking families always work in competition, but 1912, or I think it was the year, they all meet on Jekyll Island. It's a resort island on the coast of South Carolina. It's now open to the public. You can tour it. They've got, well, just to give you an idea, one of the cabins has 17 bathrooms. So that's the kind of resort it was. It was owned by Senator, it was owned by many of these bankers, but all the New York bankers took the train owned by Senator Nelson Aldrich. And he was the president of the Senate Banking Committee. And they were assigned to reform the banking system because all these crashes that had happened before, people were kind of ticked off. And so the guy supposed to be doing the reforming goes to meet on the island with all these bankers, Morgans. Let me tell you some of the names that were there. Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschilds, Paul Warburg, his brother Max, who ran all the German Rothschild banks. They're all meeting on Jekyll Island to reform the banking system that they've been manipulating else with. But what came out of it is they said, look, we've been competitors, let's now work together. And we got the Federal Reserve System, which is terrible. Basically means the government has to borrow money they have to pay interest on its own money. Without going into the details, G. Edward Griffin has some interesting quotes on this. And he's done some of the best work on this. And he's the guy who wrote Creature from Jekyll Island. I don't think the Federal Reserve should be audited. I think it should be abolished. 7 reasons. 1, it is incapable of accomplishing its stated objective. 2, it is a cartel operating against the public interest. 3, it is a supreme instrument of usury. 4, it generates our most unfair tax. It's inflation. 5, it encourages war. 6, it destabilizes the economy. And 7, it is an instrument of totalitarianism. Woodrow Wilson, who was put into power as a president, specifically to usher in the Federal Reserve, writes in 1919, I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. World War I starts the following year. We've been at war ever since. 1917, the bankers in London and America financed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They did this because they didn't want competition. They wanted to overthrow free Russia. The Wall Street bankers wanted access to Russia's resources. Fast forward to the 1929, the Great Depression, absolutely caused by the Federal Reserve. They absolutely could have been prevented had they done the right thing with money supply. They did it on purpose to swoop in and buy up assets. FDR is in office. a lot of these bankers didn't like some of his populist policies, so they did what they created what was called the banker's plot. I'm sorry, the business plot. I've got to take it back a year. 1933, Brown Brothers, Harriman, a bunch of Wall Street banks financed Hitler to fight against the Bolsheviks that they'd already created 15 years earlier. All wars are banker wars. The business plot. General Smedley Butler was a Marine. Major General Smedley Butler was a very well-respected Marine. The fighting men loved him. He wrote a book called War is a Racket, and I'm going to give you a long quote from him because it's worth reading this. But what had the business leaders, and this was Papa Bush and some of their cronies that ended up founding the FBI, the CIA, and the U.S. Intelligence Office, were the ones behind it. They actually asked this guy to help overthrow FDR, and he went along with it. And then when it was time for action, said, absolutely not, I'm not going to commit treason. He turned them in, and none of them went to jail because they threatened to crash the economy in the middle of the Depression. And it wasn't until the start of World War II that FDR was able to prosecute a few of them under the Trading with the Enemy Act, but that was 10 years later. But this quote from Butler is, this is 1935 testimony to Congress. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics, banana republics, for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, equally the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. World War II, Britain's lost its power, financial, and we need a new financial system coming out of it. It's obviously America is going to be the new financial power. They signed what's called the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. The US dollar becomes the currency, the reserve currency for the world, with 2 conditions. They told the world: the Fed would refrain from overprinting the dollar, and the US dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. Didn't last too long. Actually, it lasted a couple decades. Fast forward about 9 years after that, or sorry, 10 years after that, JFK doesn't really like our monetary system. On June 4th, 1963, issues Executive Order 11110 that returned to the US government the power to issue currency without going through the Federal Reserve. And he was killed 5 months later. A lot of coincidences going on with these deaths in banks. There's a big issue with the dollar convertibility to gold. People didn't believe we had the gold, and we didn't. France was starting to actually ask to redeem their dollars for gold, and Nixon puts a stop to that in 1971, temporarily suspends redemption of dollar for gold. Well, that gives us a bit of a problem. This is what really started to launch the inflation of the 70s. That had to be solved somewhere. Something, everyone thought it had to be back, and that's where they entered into we sold American protection to the Saudis and reserve for using the petrodollar. So all oil had to be tradable in dollars. And that's how that gave Americans about a 20% boost in value to all of the currencies, and it's still going on today. It's being attacked, hopefully. So we'll see where it goes. Modern days, we have central banks in almost every single country in the world. I'm going to give you a list of the ones that haven't had one in the last 10 years, and you see if you notice a pattern. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Iran, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and Venezuela. All countries that we've got some kind of military engagement or we've toppled their regime. I like this last quote from Sarkozy. Libya is a threat to the financial security of the world. So we invaded. And that's pretty much the moral of the story. Where do we go from here? I'm open to suggestions.
Get people in power who can change it.
Yeah, you know, what we really need to do is it's he who controls the money rules, and we the people should control our money through our elected leaders, but we can't trust our elected leaders. That's the problem. So we need to fix that part.
What do you think about, I think it's El Salvador is mining their own Bitcoin using the energy of a volcano.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not gonna, the Bitcoin is a revolutionary idea. It's impractical to be a medium of exchange, but it's going to open up a whole lot of other ideas and stuff like that. You know, there's a really good chance that you know, whatever happens soon, I think not Ethereum, but what's the one? XRP is got a chance because it's already being used for cross-border currency transactions in like less than 5 seconds. You know, if you ever try to wire international money, you know, that's useful. But again, it really doesn't matter what the medium is. We could use sticks of wood. What matters is who controls the supply. Now, Bitcoin is a finite universe, but wouldn't you want a responsible body that could expand the monetary base when it was necessary, and then not do it for their own benefit? That's where we want to be. Does it have to be a gold back? Gold has value. Is gold useful? Not really. It has value because we say it does. They used they say they used the Easter Island statues as currency, although I can't imagine how that would work. But
Tobacco was currency for a while.
absolutely, that's a good point, Todd. Tobacco was used as currency, and what's funny is what they did is they would send the oldest tobacco to pay off their debts and keep the good tobacco for themselves to ship for money and stuff like that. Didn't work out. Bad money will always chase out good. That's the problem with tobacco. And then, of course, people realized that and they started growing more tobacco, which caused hyperinflation and it became useless. But it really doesn't matter what we use as a currency. It matters who controls the supply. And you know, can we write an algorithm? Yeah, maybe. Can we have a cryptocurrency? The answer is no. What happens if we get an EMP pulse or power goes out? You have to have something that we can exchange, and it doesn't matter what it is. It's what we agree on. But more important is who is it that controls the supply? Do we have a responsible body? Can we have a government that isn't going to sell itself out to the greedy bankers in the future? Because all wars are banker wars. We don't have any need for war. That should be done with. I mean, all of it. The world should be at peace because we can solve this stuff. We can solve it tomorrow.